means no, that's another one. No means no. It's like, no, it doesn't. All right? Look, no means no. No, that means no. All right, but no, stop it. What are you doing? Oh, my God. You're being so bad. Stop it. No. Yeah, that's not a fucking no. That means I want to do it, but I'm afraid you're going to judge me, so I'm just going to make it look like it was your idea so you don't figure out that I've already performed this act with 40 other fucking people. Right? But then you go to court and you get a bad read and there's some guy reading it. Your Honor, she said no. Stop it. What are you doing? You're being so bad. Yeah, and you're just sitting there like, she didn't fucking say it like that. She didn't say it like that.
Good morning. It's Saturday, Rules Saturday, February the 14th. Happy Valentine's Day. And this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we'll have no free lunch, rules for retrogrades, and the Mossad. All that and more when I get back. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you, and now there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
All taxation, however disguised, is a loss per se. It is the duty and the sacred duty of government to take only from the people what is necessary to the proper discharge of the public service. And that taxation in any other mode is simply in one shape or another legalized robbery. Richard Cartwright. Treating the tax code as a pure funding mechanism for government is right and proper, and of course invites public discussion on what kind of government is wanted, and therefore to be paid for. But to treat the tax code as a means of administering social policy, of punishing one group or rewarding another, is unethical. Using the tax code as a redistributionist Ponzi distorts its proper function and usurps freedom and property.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for retrogrades.
Rule 26. The retrograde must use Saul Alinsky's shrewdest, trickiest rules for radicals against the radicals themselves. We will examine how to specifically reverse two of his rules, 4 and 13. Respectively, these two rules read, make the enemy live up to his own book of rules, and pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. First, let's polarize Alinsky's Rule 4. Make the enemy live up to his own book of rules. Alinsky admits openly that he was inspired, naturally or supernaturally, by the tactics of the devil, who simply cherishes the contempt of hypocrisy. According to both scripture and tradition, Lucifer was and is fascinated by both the concept and the implementation of hypocrisy, employing it wherever opportune on his own behalf and pointing it out in others whenever expedient, which of course indicates his implementation of a sort of meta-hypocrisy, a hypocrisy within hypocrisy. No surprise, then, that Alinsky's favorite tactic involved decrying hypocrisy and anything else looking like hypocrisy in his political opponents. Every American general election cycle, radicals across the land furiously forage the political landscape for any and all indicia of the slightest instance of hypocrisy by the religious right, which they find, of course, since all humans make mistakes. What's truly diabolic in this modus operandi is the startling consequence that Americans have generally given purchase to the radical lie that an act of hypocrisy by Party A equates to an automatic score for his rival, Party B. Naturally, the consequence of unintelligent voter behavior continues to incentivize radicals to weaponize hypocrisy. We must turn the tide by making radicals meet muster, a double twist to be sure. In other words, force the enemy to live up to his own rules, about enemies living up to their own rules. In order to accomplish this, Christians must become more adept at weaponizing the radical concept of equality. Radical impunity against Christians, in the name of equality, violates justice. Retrogrades must resolve this abuse of so-called equality for themselves. For example, consider the radical community organizing effort from 2012 until 2017 that resulted in the temporary coercion of Christian bakers in Colorado to produce cakes for celebrants of homosexual civil unions, until the Court of Appeals holding was overturned in the Supreme Court in 2018 in favor of the bakeries. Supposedly value-neutral jurisprudence in America, such as the decidedly anti-Christian holding by the Court of Appeals, has never actually been neutral, notwithstanding its claims. Without other opinions, the retrograde must negate the enemy's legal tactics culturally. He must do this by showing that, one way or another, an immoral application of one of the rules for radicals against a Christian can easily be weaponized by that same Christian. In the absence of an eventual overturn by the Supreme Court, Christian bakers might have ironically employed Alinsky's Rule 4 by posting signs in their bakeries saying, all profits from wedding cakes for homosexual civil unions will be diverted exclusively to heteronormative religious causes. This would classify as a defensive tactic, as it rebuffs prospectively against enforceable requests by homosexuals for wedding cakes. Sure enough, between 2012 and 2017, Christian cake shops might have been legally required to violate their Christian scruples, but this way, at least they could use the profits to strike against the very occasion of the radicals' oppression. More importantly, their signs would likely have deterred homosexuals from requesting, i.e. requiring, them to provide such cakes. The radical insistence on a certain type of equality under the law would, in that case, work in favor of Christians for once. The Christian baker would have successfully reversed Alinsky's Rule 4, even in the face of legal defeat. Alinsky's Rule 13, being offensive rather than defensive, allows for a more aggressive response to the same circumstances. Pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. Operating on the basis of Rule 13 from 2012 until 2017, the retrograde might have struck back, locating and then patronizing bakeries run by radical anti-Christian homosexualists and forcibly requesting Christian and heteronormative-themed wedding cakes. This would be the retrograde's more ambitious way of affirming the exclusivity of man-woman marriages. Pick the target, i.e., an opposition bakery, personalize the message, and polarize what they attempted to do to Christians. The radical left won't live and let live, so why should we? Forcible viewpoint discrimination in the realm of baker harassment cuts both ways, after all. The retrograde must see to it that it does. While the Supreme Court eventually rendered the issue moot in 2018, the hot-button issue of Christian bakeries and homosexual wedding cakes provided an excellent opportunity to exercise the retrograde's moral imagination. It will prove both necessary and worthwhile to anticipate what retrogrades may do, defensively and offensively, in a foreseeable day to come, when the ultimate holding may not be as innocuous to Christians as that rendered by Masterpiece Cake Shop versus Colorado Civil Rights Commission 2018. In practice, abiding this rule of Alinsky's 13 serves to cross-reference the rule for retrogrades enjoying a perennial offensive counterattack. The reader can plainly see how much more effective the offensive application of Alinsky's rules are than the defensive. Once more, always be on offense.
Thank you. So, a couple of things. First of all, when about this particular case and the guy that objected to it, I first think that this whole case was political theater, that it was a setup from the very beginning, that the gay people and their lawyers found a quote-unquote victim to prosecute in order to get this issue to the Supreme Court. Because if they could get a favorable Supreme Court ruling, then that basically sets the idea in stone. Now, as a baker, he shouldn't have a problem with baking a cake for anybody. I don't care what you want to do with it. If you're going to do it for a gay wedding, a not gay wedding, somebody's going to marry a dolphin or a dog or whatever. What do I care? Here's your cake. Now, the problem comes if they ask me to endorse the wedding in some way, shape, or form. Maybe they want me to or insist that I write in icing, God bless your union, or this bakery wishes you a long and happy wedding or marriage, or something like that. That's where that crosses the line. You can have the cake, you can't have my endorsement. Now, the other thing that he brought up that was really interesting was the idea of saying, okay, you want a cake for a gay wedding, then we're going to use the proceeds, what he called for heteronormative. That's awkward. What they should have just said was, we will use the proceeds to donate or give to the Catholic Church. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now on Varney and Company, he's talking with Tammy Bruce, who's a part of the Trump administration, and she says something very interesting.
And she plans to offer, quote, a working-class perspective on U.S. foreign policy. Tammy Bruce is the deputy representative for the U.S. mission to the United Nations and joins me now. With AOC there, are we, as a country, looking like a united country?
Well, absolutely. We're looking like America. There's a bunch of different opinions. We embrace everyone. And it's good for Europe to be reminded that the scourge that destroyed them just in the last century.
These days you are a diplomat.
Yeah, of course. That's what...
Okay, so it'd be nice if Varney would shut up and let her finish her answer. But anyhow, the thing she said is, we're a country that welcomes everybody and, I'm paraphrasing, welcomes diversity of opinion. Now, what's interesting about this is that the left is listening to this. There's a lot of lefties out there, the down for the struggle types. The useful idiots aren't bothering with it, but the down for the struggle types are listening. And when she says something like that, they lick their lips. Ooh, they love it, because she's making a value statement. And they intend to find a way to use that value statement as a weapon against her, as a weapon against the administration, as a weapon against all conservatives. Back in a minute. Thank you. A little bit more of Varney and Company.
Okay, and in New York City, Mayor Mandani is asking lawmakers for a 2% tax hike on the wealthy. With the socialists, it's always tax the rich and never cut spending.
Okay, so, and he's baffled by that. How come? How come they never talk about cutting spending? It's because of something called the malevolent universe premise. The socialists see the universe as a scary place that's unknowable, and that therefore failure is to be expected. Well, if that's the case, then how do you explain all the success that's around us? They say, well, that's simple. It's because the successful cheat, get lucky, or a combination of the two. So the more successful you are, the more you must be cheating, getting lucky, or a combination of the two. And that's why the left is always saying we need to make the rich pay their fair share. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Mossad.
November 2011. Paris. A man steps out of a door beside an old cinema, turns up his collar against the rain, and walks toward the metro. His neighbors know him as Jean-Pierre Mercier, a retired sound engineer from Lyon. 3 blocks away, a woman photographs him with a camera disguised as a mobile phone. In Tel Aviv, analysts will spend the next 48 hours comparing his face to a photograph taken in Beirut in 1994. The man who calls himself Mercier is about to discover that some debts cannot be outrun. On the morning of March 17, 1992, a car bomb exploded outside the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires, Argentina. The blast killed 29 people and injured 242. Among the dead were Israeli diplomats, Argentine civilians, and a Catholic priest who had been walking past the building at the moment of detonation. The explosion shattered windows for blocks in every direction, leaving a crater in the street that would take months to repair. The investigation that followed identified the attack as the work of a network with connections to Hezbollah and Iranian intelligence. Several individuals were named as suspects, their photographs distributed to intelligence agencies around the world. Most were eventually located. Some killed in subsequent operations, others arrested by various governments. A few dying of natural causes before justice could reach them. One name remained on the list for years without resolution: Khalid al-Rami. Al-Rami had been, Born in the Bekaa Valley in 1958, the son of a schoolteacher and a woman who worked in the tobacco fields. He had shown early aptitude for languages, learning French from missionaries and English from American university lecturers who visited the region. By his early 20s, he had become valuable to organizations that needed people who could move across borders without attracting attention. His gift was not violence, but logistics, the ability to arrange the 1,000 details that made complex operations possible. His role in the Buenos Aires attack was logistical rather than operational. According to intelligence assessments, he had helped arrange the vehicle, the documentation, and the safe houses used by the bombing team. He had coordinated communications between cells that could not safely contact each other directly. He had not built the bomb or driven the car. But without his work, the attack could not have happened. In the months following the bombing, al-Rami vanished. His apartment in Beirut was found empty, cleared of personal effects with the thoroughness of someone who had planned his disappearance in advance. His known associates claimed ignorance of his whereabouts, and those claims held up under interrogation. He simply ceased to exist, as if the man named Khalid al-Rami had been erased from the world. For Israeli intelligence, al-Rami became what professionals call a cold file, a case that remained officially open but received diminishing attention as years passed and newer threats demanded resources. His photograph was circulated to liaison services. His name was flagged in databases. But active pursuit was suspended, replaced by the hope that he would eventually make a mistake that would bring him back into view. That mistake came 17 years later in a place no one had thought to look. The break in the al-Rami case came not from sophisticated electronic surveillance or a well-placed informant, but from a cardboard box in a basement in Beirut. In March 2009, an asset working for Israeli intelligence inside Lebanon was tasked with a routine assignment: photographing documents related to a financial network suspected of supporting Hezbollah operations. The asset had access to a building that served as an unofficial archive for various organizations, a repository of records that were too sensitive to destroy but too dangerous to keep in more accessible locations. Among the materials the asset photographed was a box of personal effects that had belonged to a deceased member of Hezbollah's security apparatus. The man had died of a heart attack in 2006, and his belongings had been stored, pending a decision about their disposition. The box contained letters, receipts, identity documents, and several hundred photographs spanning 3 decades of a life lived in the shadows of Lebanon's perpetual conflicts. One photograph, dated June 2005, according to the notation on its reverse, showed a group of men at what appeared to be a social gathering. In the background, partially obscured by other guests, was a face that an analyst in Tel Aviv found familiar. The photograph was of poor quality, taken at an angle that captured the subject only in profile. But facial recognition software, combined with aging algorithms that estimated how a younger face might change over decades, produced a match with moderate confidence. The face in the background belonged to someone who resembled Khalid al-Rami, as he might appear in his late 40s. The photograph's metadata provided another clue. The decoration visible in the background suggested a European location, possibly French. A street sign partially visible through a window was eventually identified as belonging to a neighborhood in Paris. The wine bottles on the table were brands available primarily in the Ile-de-France region. For the first time in 17 years, there was a lead. Al-Rami might be alive, and he might be living in France. Finding one man in a city of 2 million is a task that requires patience, resources, and a methodology that can narrow an impossibly large search area to something manageable. Paris presented particular challenges: a city where privacy was valued, where diversity was celebrated, and where a man with an accent could disappear into neighborhoods where no one asked questions about the past. The operation that would eventually locate Khalid al-Rami began with the photograph and expanded outward in concentric circles of investigation. Analysts examined every detail of the image, the wallpaper pattern, the furniture style, the lighting fixtures, the clothing worn by the other guests. They consulted experts in French interior design who dated the decor to the late 1990s or early 2000s. The street sign visible through the window was traced to the 11th arrondissement, a neighborhood in eastern Paris known for its diverse population and its tradition of providing anonymity to those who sought it. This narrowed the search area from an entire metropolis to approximately 30,000 residents. Mossad requested assistance from French intelligence through channels that had been established decades earlier. The request was carefully worded to avoid revealing the true target, framed instead as an inquiry about possible Hezbollah support networks in the Paris region. French counterterrorism officials agreed to share certain categories of information. Over the following months, analysts built a list of individuals in the target area whose backgrounds contained anomalies, naturalization records that appeared incomplete, employment histories with gaps, social connections that seemed deliberately minimal. The list eventually contained 47 names, 47 individuals who warranted closer examination. None of them was Jean-Pierre Mercier. The limitation of database searches is that they can only find people who exist in databases. A man who has truly disappeared, who has built a new identity from scratch using methods that predate the digital era, leaves no electronic traces to follow. Khalid al-Rami had understood this since the beginning of his flight. When he arrived in France in 1994, traveling on forged Lebanese documents that identified him as a merchant from Tripoli, he did not immediately attempt to establish a permanent identity. Instead, he spent 2 years moving through the country, working casual jobs that paid cash, living in rooms rented by the week, learning the rhythms of a society where he intended to hide for the rest of his life. By 1996, he had accumulated enough knowledge to create Jean-Pierre Mercier. The identity was built on the foundation of a real person, a man who had died in a car accident in Lyon in 1987, and whose death had been recorded only in local archives that were not yet digitized. Al-Rami obtained copies of Mercier's birth certificate through a corrupt clerk who asked no questions in exchange for a modest payment. He used them to acquire replacement identity documents claiming the originals had been lost. The physical transformation was equally methodical. He gained weight, not dramatically, but enough to change the shape of his face. He wore glasses he did not need, a simple modification that altered his appearance significantly. He grew his hair longer than he had worn it in Lebanon and adopted the casual dress of a French retiree. He chose the apartment above the Cinema Lumière because it met his requirements. A landlord who preferred cash and asked few questions, a neighborhood diverse enough that a man with an accent would not stand out, and a location that offered multiple escape routes should they ever become necessary. For more than a decade, the system worked perfectly. Jean-Pierre Mercier paid his taxes, voted in local elections, attended Mass on Sundays, and became so ordinary that no one had any reason to notice him. The problem was the photograph. Somewhere in Beirut, someone had captured an image at a gathering Al-Rami had attended during a rare trip outside France, a moment of weakness when he had allowed himself to reconnect briefly with old associates. He had believed the photograph was destroyed. He was wrong. By the summer of 2010, the investigation had reached an impasse. The database searches had produced no viable candidates. The photograph provided no additional leads. Some within Mossad argued that after 18 years, Khalid al-Rami should be moved permanently to the cold files. The decision to continue came from a senior officer who had worked on the original Buenos Aires investigation and remembered the names of every victim. He authorized one final phase: human surveillance of the 11th arrondissement, conducted by operatives who would look for anomalies that no database could capture. The operative assigned to the Cinema Lumière sector was a woman in her early 30s who had spent 5 years working undercover in various European cities. Her cover for this assignment was a doctoral student researching the history of independent cinema in Paris, a role that gave her reason to frequent the neighborhood and ask questions about local institutions. She arrived in September 2010 and began her work methodically. She attended screenings at the Cinema Lumière. She interviewed the owner about the building's history. She became a regular at the cafe across the street, where she could observe the comings and goings of the apartments above the marquee. For 6 months, she saw nothing unusual. The tenants were exactly what they appeared to be: students, artists, elderly pensioners, the ordinary population of an ordinary Parisian neighborhood. Then, in March 2011, she noticed something that would change everything. The man in apartment 4 attended Mass every Sunday at the Church of Saint Ambroise, approximately 800 meters from his residence. He walked the same route each week, leaving at precisely 9:15 in the morning and returning by 11:30. He sat in the same pew, received communion, and spoke to no one beyond the minimal courtesies required by the liturgy. The operative noticed him because of that discipline. In her experience, people who maintained rigid routines were often trying to impose order on lives that had once been chaotic. They were trying to become invisible by becoming predictable. She began observing him more closely. He was approximately 50 years old, physically fit for his age, with the careful movements of someone who had been trained to be aware of his surroundings. His eyes swept the street as he walked, not nervously, but systematically. He paid for everything in cash. He received no mail except utility bills and municipal notices. Most significantly, he never spoke about his past. In the small interactions, she managed to observe at the local bakery, at the pharmacy, at the newspaper kiosk. He deflected personal questions with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed his responses many times. She observed that his French, while fluent, contained occasional constructions that were not quite native. Small errors that a Frenchman from Lyon would not make. The wrong preposition in an idiomatic expression, a slight hesitation before words that should have been automatic. In April 2011, she managed to photograph him from across the street as he returned from Mass. The image was transmitted through secure channels that evening. The facial recognition match came back at 73% confidence. It was not definitive, but it was high enough to justify the next phase of the operation. Confirming the identity of a man who has spent nearly 2 decades building a false life requires more than facial recognition software. It requires evidence that connects the present persona to the past identity, proof that Jean-Pierre Mercier and Khaled Al-Rami were the same person. The operation entered a new phase in June 2011, with additional resources deployed to establish this connection. A team specializing in technical surveillance installed monitoring equipment in the cafe across the street, positioning cameras that could observe the entrance to the building and microphones sensitive enough to capture conversations on the sidewalk. Another team tracked the target's movements throughout the city. They discovered that Jean-Pierre Mercier visited the Bibliothèque Nationale twice monthly, where he read Arabic newspapers from Lebanon and Syria. He walked through the Jardin du Luxembourg on Tuesday afternoons, always following the same path. He made occasional trips to a pharmacy in the 5th arrondissement, far from his neighborhood, where he purchased medications that suggested a heart condition. The breakthrough came in September, when the target made a telephone call from a public phone in a metro station. The conversation, conducted in Arabic, was brief but revealing. He spoke to someone about a family matter, mentioning names and places that were consistent with Khaled Al-Rami's known biography. He referred to a sister named Fatima who lived in the Bekaa Valley. He mentioned a nephew who had recently married. He asked about the health of an elderly aunt whose name matched records from the Al-Rami family file. He also mentioned, in passing, that he had not been back to Lebanon since the year of the bombing. It was not a confession, but it was enough. The man living above the Cinema Lumière was almost certainly Khaled Al-Rami. In Israeli intelligence, decisions about how to handle confirmed targets involve calculations that weigh operational feasibility against political consequences. Assassination on French soil would trigger a diplomatic crisis that could damage relationships carefully cultivated over decades. Extraction would require resources and planning that might not be justified for a target whose operational value had long since expired. Al-Rami was not a current threat. He was an old man living a quiet life, his knowledge of operations nearly 2 decades out of date. There was a third option. The information could be shared with French authorities through channels that would allow them to take action while maintaining Israeli deniability. In November 2011, a carefully prepared dossier was delivered to French counterterrorism officials. The document contained evidence linking Jean-Pierre Mercier to Khalid al-Rami, including the results of facial recognition analysis, the intercepted telephone conversation, and historical records documenting al-Rami's role in the Buenos Aires bombing. The dossier did not explain how this information had been obtained. It simply presented the facts and left the French to decide how to proceed. French authorities moved with a speed that surprised even the Israelis who had provided the intelligence. On the morning of December 3, 2011, officers from the Direction Générale de la Sécurité Intérieure arrived at the Cinema Lumière shortly after 7 in the morning. They came in unmarked vehicles, wearing civilian clothes, moving with the quiet efficiency of professionals who had conducted similar operations many times. The officers climbed the stairs to apartment 4 and knocked on the door. The man who answered was calm, as if he had always known this moment would come. He was dressed in the simple clothing he wore each day. His face showed no surprise, no fear, only the resignation of someone who had been waiting for 19 years and was almost relieved that the waiting was finally over. He did not resist when they identified themselves. He did not ask what he was being accused of. He simply nodded, retrieved his coat from a hook by the door, and accompanied the officers down the stairs. The Cinema Lumière was not yet open. Its marquee advertised a retrospective of films by Alain Resnais, director of Hiroshima Mon Amour and Night and Fog, films about memory and guilt and the impossibility of escaping the past. The man who had lived above that marquee for more than 4 years didn't look up as he passed beneath it. Khalid al-Rami's 19 years of disappearance had come to an end. The interrogation of the man known as Jean-Pierre Mercier lasted 47 days and produced results that satisfied no one completely. He acknowledged from the beginning that his French identity was fabricated. There was no point in denying what the evidence clearly proved. He provided details about how he had constructed the identity, information that French intelligence found valuable for understanding methods that other fugitives might employ. But on the question of his true identity, he maintained a position of studied ambiguity. He neither confirmed nor denied that he was Khalid al-Rami. When interrogators presented evidence connecting him to the Buenos Aires bombing, he declined to respond. When they played recordings of his telephone conversation, he acknowledged the voice was his, but refused to explain the references to family members in Lebanon. One interrogator later described him as a man who had already died once and was not afraid of dying again. Another said he seemed to have made peace with his situation long before his arrest, as if the decades of hiding had been a form of purgatory that he was finally being released from. After 47 days, the interrogators concluded that further questioning would produce no additional results. The man would not confess to being Khalid al-Rami. He would carry whatever secrets he possessed to his grave. The legal proceedings against the man known as Jean-Pierre Mercier lasted 3 years and raised questions that remain unresolved to this day. French prosecutors charged him with immigration fraud, identity, theft, and complicity in the 1992 Buenos Aires bombing. The first 2 charges were straightforward, supported by documentary evidence that proved his French identity was fabricated. The third charge was more complicated, requiring the French court to accept evidence gathered by foreign intelligence services whose methods could not be fully disclosed. Throughout the trial, the defendant maintained a position that was neither confession nor denial. He acknowledged that his French identity was false, but declined to confirm or deny that he was Khalid al-Rami. He refused to discuss the Buenos Aires bombing, invoking his right to silence whenever prosecutors raised the subject. In 2014, the court convicted him on the immigration and identity charges, sentencing him to 8 years in prison. The terrorism charge was dropped for lack of admissible evidence, a decision that satisfied no one but reflected the legal realities of prosecuting crimes committed decades earlier on another continent. He served his sentence in a facility outside Paris, a modern prison designed to house inmates who required isolation from the general population. He was permitted visitors, but received none. He was offered the opportunity to participate in educational programs, but declined. He spent most of his time reading. The prison librarian later recalled that his reading interests were eclectic. French literature from the 19th century, theological works from both Catholic and Islamic traditions, histories of the Middle East and Latin America. He never discussed what he read with other inmates or with the staff who monitored his activities. He was a model prisoner who caused no problems and attracted no attention. He followed rules without complaint and maintained the same rigid routines he had observed during his years of freedom. He attended Mass in the prison chapel on Sundays, sitting alone in the back row. His health declined gradually during his incarceration. The heart condition that had required medications became more severe. He was offered the option of early release on medical grounds, but declined, saying he preferred to complete his sentence. Whether he found redemption in those years or simply another form of hiding remains unknown. The Cinema Lumière closed in 2015, a victim of changing tastes and rising rents that made independent theaters economically unviable. The building was sold to developers who converted it into luxury apartments, erasing the marquee that had stood on Rue Oberkampf for nearly 90 years. The neighbors who had known Jean-Pierre Mercier expressed varying degrees of shock when they learned his true identity. Some refused to believe it, insisting that the quiet man who attended Sunday Mass could not have been involved in terrorism. Others claimed they had always sensed something unusual about him, rewriting their memories to include suspicions they had never actually felt. In Argentina, the families of the Buenos Aires bombing victims received the news of al-Rami's capture with emotions that ranged from satisfaction to disappointment. Satisfaction that at least one more participant had been found. Disappointment that his conviction would be for immigration fraud rather than murder, that the full truth of his involvement would never be established in court. The photograph that had started the investigation remains in Israeli archives, a grainy image of a social gathering in Beirut where a man made the mistake of allowing his face to be captured. It sits in a file alongside hundreds of other documents that trace the 7-year hunt for a man who thought he had disappeared forever. Some files close with definitive conclusions. The al-Rami file closes with questions that will never be fully answered. Was he truly the logistics coordinator for the Buenos Aires bombing, or was he a minor figure whose importance was exaggerated? Did he spend his years in Paris, regretting the violence he had enabled, or did he simply calculate that hiding was preferable to dying? Did he find peace in the rituals of his adopted religion, or was mass attendance simply another element of his cover? The man himself has never said. The cinema where he hid no longer exists to keep his secrets, and somewhere the truth waits to be discovered by someone who has not yet been born. 19 years of hiding. A false name built from a dead man's documents, and one photograph at a gathering he should never have attended. They found him above a cinema in Paris, living a life so ordinary that no one looked twice. The neighbors thought he was a retired sound engineer. The analysts in Tel Aviv knew he was something else entirely. He is free now, his sentence complete, his location unknown. The cinema where he hid no longer exists. What remains are questions that will never be answered, and a truth that only one man knows.
And that was the Mossad. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you that you're not neutral and that the government has no rights.